we're back to talk about more of Anthony. Anthony is such a heroic figure to many. He is someone who sets the bar in a way that seems to be unattainable, and that's sort of okay. It's almost like he went out into the desert and studied from these other hermits and these other monks, and if one was good at prayer and another was good at fasting and another was good at meditation, Anthony learned the skills of all of them, and he became the sort of super monk. If he took all the lesser monks and put them in a laboratory, out would come Anthony. Well, Athanasius, in telling this story, and probably many people in remembering Anthony this way, the legacy is, of course, overblown. It's, of course, unattainable. And yet it sets the bar so high that everyone has something to strive for. Remember, these are athletes. They need a pace setter. So it's a spiritual discipline that they're setting out on. And it's not for everyone, but those who are called to live this extreme life of spiritual warfare and spiritual discipline, Anthony is the prime example. So when we read this text, that raises a lot of theological questions. And there are so many questions we could discuss about these things. I want to take on two big ones and kind of see if we ask our question of the text, what does the text offer us in response? What if we ask this text about works righteousness? Isn't Anthony way too concerned about somehow pleasing God and doing all of this extravagant, elaborate, ascetic lifestyle so that he's earning his salvation in some way? Well, that's a fair question. I mean, let me put the question this way. Would Martin Luther approve of this text? The answer is certainly no. Martin Luther did not approve of monastic texts. Although he was a monk himself, in his conversion to Protestantism, he is going to abandon all of that and see that as entirely bound up in works righteousness. And of course, I'm Protestant through and through, and so I'm on Team Luther, if that's what it has to come down to. But I don't think it has to be an either or with this text. This early text, Anthony's life is not one of trying to earn his salvation, although I will admit he's not all that careful in talking about salvation. And I want to just give credit there to the fact that he's not answering the question that Martin Luther is asking. And we saw this already with Cyprian. If you go back and look at the video there that we did on Cyprian's text on works and almsgiving, that's the title of his text, seems to be a lot about works. And it's definitely a lot about salvation. But is it works righteousness? And if you go back and look at the end of that video, I gave a lot of verses that Jesus himself, Paul himself, all over the New Testament, there's a lot to say about works. There's a lot to say about what Christians do, and there's even a lot to say about reward and how that plays into our salvation. So my point here is it's hard to blame Anthony or Cyprian or these ancient writers for talking in a way that sounds a lot like the whole New Testament talks. So if you were to ask Anthony the question that, say, Paul was asking in Antioch or in Galatia, can you be saved by obeying the works of the law? I would like to think Anthony would say, no, of course not. In fact, even though that text is never directly brought to Anthony's attention or to Athanasius, the narrator's attention, it's almost as if they can't help themselves. And there are times when the need to speak to God's grace just it interrupts the flow. So there's one quote I'll give you in particular, and this shows up where Anthony has been struggling with these demonic forces, and it turns out that we read where Athanasius, the narrator, says that working with Anthony was the Lord, who for us bore flesh and gave the body victory over the devil, so much so that those who struggle like Anthony can say, it is not I, but the grace of God that is in me. I mean, that's pretty good. I think Martin Luther would be really happy with that statement. He would probably want Anthony and Athanasius to do more of that and to couch and frame the whole thing in terms of grace, and they don't. But I say it's hard to blame them for talking about things that when they're not answering the same question as Martin Luther. So give Anthony credit, give Athanasius the narrator credit. When the issue of grace comes up, they're very explicit. Anthony was already saved by Jesus, and now the question is, for Anthony, what is Jesus asking of him in return? And he asks him for a life of devotion. And that means for Anthony an extreme, a martyrdom that looks almost like a visible martyrdom. It's a death to self daily, as it's called at the end of this text, and yet it's a complete denial of self, an abandonment of one's possessions and wealth, a complete devotion to God in daily prayer, fasting, meditation, an extreme spiritual form of discipline that not all seem to be called to in the life of Anthony, but Anthony was called to that. And that's not an attempt to work toward one's salvation. That's a response to salvation. That's the grace of Jesus in Anthony, at least according to Athanasius. Okay, but what about evangelism? We asked in the last segment, what would Martin Luther think about this text? What would someone like Billy Graham think about this text? It looks like Anthony is way too concerned to escape from the world and not be in the world. And that's a valid question. There are multiple levels, not just in terms of evangelism, but in terms of social work and care for our neighbors, love of others. Why isn't Anthony concerned about any of that? Well, oddly enough, that actually becomes sort of the front and center of what happens to Anthony. Anthony seems to feel a call to escape and to flee the world in terms of the society and live on the margins. And then somehow or another, the world keeps coming to Anthony. And he's out there in the middle of nowhere, but more and more pilgrims and people speaking spiritual guidance are looking for Anthony and come to him despite how hard it is. The final portions, he's out so far, you have to take a caravan. And some people die trying to get out there. Don't worry, a miracle happens. They're raised from the dead. And Anthony doesn't seem concerned, and God still seems to use Anthony anyway. So Athanasius at the end of this text has several statements where it's clear he thinks Anthony is doing evangelism. He thinks Anthony's message is spreading the message of Jesus to the world. Let me read you a few of those. Almost to the very end of the text, Anthony has died, and Athanasius is telling what happens there, and he gives this statement. He said, "This is a clear sign of God's favor over Anthony because Anthony's fame spread everywhere, and everyone saw him, marveled at him, and even those who had never seen him long to be near him." So everybody's heard of him. Many people are coming to see him, and many people who can't want to, because everyone knows about Anthony. And why is that? Well, here again is where grace comes in. And Athanasius says no one would deny that this was a gift from God. For how has he heard about, even though he's in Egypt, you see, how's he heard about all the way over in Spain and up in Gaul? And he was heard about in Rome and in Africa, that is Western North Africa, while he was hidden on a mountain. Except that God, who makes known everywhere those who belong to him from the beginning, promised to use Anthony in this way. So you see, Anthony's like a lamp that cannot be hidden under a bushel. So yes, it's true that it looks to us like Anthony is not doing evangelism, but to Athanasius, it looks like that's exactly what Anthony is doing. So how can Athanasius claim this is evangelism? Anthony doesn't look like he's doing evangelism unless we were to rethink sort of our model of evangelism. Maybe there are different emphases, things along a spectrum. And I'll give you three of these. And these sort of, I think, maybe not models, or maybe these are different coordinates we could use to talk about evangelism. And it's especially helpful to think in a different time and place. How did this work in the ancient world, even though it is different than how we've been taught to think of it in our time? So along the sort of x-axis, if you were thinking about, one extreme or the other, there is this distinction between word and deed. Clearly, being a witness is being willing to confess Jesus before those on earth so that Jesus will confess us before our Father in heaven. Now, in that emphasis on the word, on the testimony and the preaching is an important one that I don't think anyone would want to deny, but it's not the only one. St. Francis of Assisi is often quoted as saying, "Everywhere you go, preach the gospel, and when necessary, use words." Because for him, the emphasis is on the deeds, a life of being a Christ follower will stand out and will be a witness. You might be the only Jesus people ever see. You might be the only gospel, your life, that people ever hear. Well, while I don't think we would want to exchange one for the other, there's certainly an emphasis here where Anthony is not going out and preaching, but his life, his actions, his extreme devotion to God is one that attracts people. And even then, he's willing to say words. It's just an emphasis on one side or the other. Now, you could think of modern examples where we are willing to do one or the other. We who think of Billy Graham, right, as a hero of modern evangelism, his emphasis is entirely on word. But I don't think he would ever want you to not do deeds, and he would say that even though not everyone can be called to be an evangelist in spoken word, we all should be willing to use our words, using our testimony, but always having a life of devotion to God. I mean, Jesus said, "By this will all know you're my disciples, that you love one another." So it's our love, it's our deeds, it's our actions, it's our life, as much as our word. Okay, that kind of elaborated a little much on that, but let's move a little quicker on these other axes, because you could think of the y-axis, and here it would be emphasis on the individual versus the communal. And again, if you're thinking in terms of, say, Billy Graham, he's one famous evangelism who goes out there and he is in the spotlight. But he would never want that to be the only person doing evangelism. He would sometimes say the church itself can have things like backyard Bible study or VBS or some sort of block party for the community. The Christian community can build a community in its own corporate life. So there is an emphasis on individual evangelism, but it shouldn't be the only emphasis. I don't think anyone would say. And Anthony certainly falls on the individual. He keeps trying to flee the world, flee society, get alone, and God bless him, as much as he keeps trying to get more and more isolated, more and more people keep coming to him. So to Athanasius, this looks like evangelism. You could also talk about another sort of set of emphases, and I'll use the fancy words here, centrifugal emphasis versus centripetal, right? And we all understand centrifugal force is like a slingshot, that outward force that moves away, versus the centripetal or gravitational force that draws in. Athanasius is telling the story of Anthony, who goes away, and in his retreat, his life draws people to him. And whether you were talking about an individual like Anthony or a community, there are many communities today who want to live an extreme form of a Christian life. They see themselves as intentional communities, and they're Christians who think that by living like this, we will be a city set on a hill that will draw people to our way of loving, our way of living, God's way of living. So whether it's that sort of inward draw or an outward going, again, Billy Graham goes out. He goes to the stadiums. He's not staying in the church. But he wouldn't deny the other side of the spectrum. You can have a revival in your church and draw people to you. So whether it's a mixture of word or deed with this centrifugal or centripetal, you see there are sort of different ways you can align your emphases on evangelism. And I don't claim to know all the answers or to know how to align these things today. But I do think that it's worth sort of revisiting these ancient texts, because if you're looking for the sort of Billy Graham style of individuals going out, passing out tracts, all about word, little about deed, you're not going to find much of that in the ancient church, really not much of any of that in the New Testament. So maybe we actually could find some very valuable resources that help spark our imagination and be inspiring to us when we look to places like Anthony. And it's great for us to ask these questions about evangelism, but we'll have to allow the question to be changed. What do you mean by evangelism, and how did ancient Christians handle that differently than we do today? Well, today as is so often the case with these texts, there's so much in them, I feel like we just scratched the surface. We just picked out one or two big questions, kind of tackled one or two interesting aspects, and we haven't done justice to the whole of this text. But hopefully we've gotten to learn some things and gotten to see things from different perspectives than we're used to seeing them. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think I'm asking anyone or would really want anyone to do what Anthony did, to go retreat and live your whole life far, far away from everyone. I mean, you better be sure that's God calling you to do that. But the odd thing is, Athanasius, nor really hardly anyone else after Anthony, thinks that they're called to do that. They all follow Anthony out to the desert, but they form communities, and whole villages pop up around these communities. Pilgrims are drawn to these communities. There's something more than just what Anthony experiences in his attempt at solitude, and yet he is an inspiration to many. So he set the bar really high. And if the rest of us are athletes and soldiers in training, and we need this bar, we need a pace setter, well, Anthony serves as that for a lot of people. So I hope this was helpful to you. I hope that you will continue to see how these spiritual disciplines like prayer and fasting, how they might have looked a lot different in the ancient world, but at the same time, there's a lot that does translate for us today.
Because all the way God was teaching Israel, all through the Old Testament, that there was one God, only one, that we're to serve and we're to worship.
Right, and that doesn't seem to you as, say, an egomaniacal position.
On God's part?
On God's part.
Oh, no, God is perfect.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, when I look in the mirror in the morning, it's hard for me to believe that.
No, you know, in God's sight, you are beautiful. And everyone, because God loves all of us, and he has the hairs of our head numbered. He sees the sparrow fall. He's interested in every detail of your life. He made you like you are. He made you Woody Allen, and he expects you to live up to a standard that he has made. And if you don't live up to it, then the Bible says you're falling short, and that's where you need God's help for redemption.